Joe from ArtAlienTV. Now today, for you space geeks and freaks out there, a lot of you may have seen this video already that I did recently, a few days back. It's called Mars City Found Amazonis. It's very difficult for me to get across how crazy this is, right? Because this is the one I showed in that video, and I showed some of the things nearby, and there's lots of right-angled structures in the ground. Now, NASA call these rings, or cratered cones, they call these. And in fact, when you look on the NASA website, it says cratered cones or rings. That's what they call them. And it's pretty obvious that these are artificial. Now, what I've done, this is the image that I showed in the previous video. Now, there's another image here which joins onto it. The main city area that I showed before here with the triangular structure there, right? And then all these other kind of right-angled structures in the ground as well, on the ground. Like this huge one here. Now there's a bunch of these with these right-angled corners. A lot of these are very large, and they're sort of 400 meters across. Some are 500, but there are loads and loads and loads of structures here. I'm not sure how many exactly, but just to give you an idea, what I'm going to do is flip this round, and then we can look at it at 90 degrees because it's very difficult to get all this on the screen. Now, there's the triangle structure there with the hexagonal crater or thing on the side of it there, right? That's the triangle structure. And then we have, if we look up above, this is the new image that I've stitched onto that one. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of structures on the ground. Now, I'm not saying all of these are artificial. Probably more than half of them are, but there's probably about 100 here altogether. And I've only really concentrated on here on the larger ones, which are 100 meters or 200 meters and above. Because if you start going down into between some of these large structures, there are dozens of pits and square holes in the ground like we have here. Now, not all of these are artificial, of course, right? But I think a lot of them are. Now that means what we have here is a very large city. And I'm just going to do this now and show you the ones I've outlined. This is days and days of work here. I've been working very hard on this. There's about 30 or so here and about another 40 up here. So you're talking about 70 that I've outlined. I haven't outlined them all. There are many, many more. There's probably over 100 large structures here that are over 200 meters in size. There's probably thousands that are much smaller than that, like I just showed you here in this area. They're all over. When you start looking in the ground, you can see these squares in the ground, and these are sort of generally about 50 meters in size. I'm not going to go through those because there's too many, and there's little information to be gained from that. Now, particularly what I've done here is I've carefully outlined the perimeters of each of these structures. And it looks like, as I said before, a lot of these large structures seem to have been hit, like this one here. Okay. Now, how do I know that? Well, if you look at this one, what I've done is I've marked the craters that have hit structures. In other words, we have here a structure and a crater which is secondary to the structure. In other words, that crater came after the structure, right? Now, let's do this. Right, now you can actually see that the edges of this crater are higher than the edges of this structure down below. Now, one or two of you did point this out to me in the comments for the last video, and that was really cool. That really helped me out because I think this is quite important. Rather than just showing the structures, I'm showing you structures that have been hit from above, possibly targeted from above. This is another good example here. And this is another large crater, which is probably about 500 meters across. Okay, you can actually measure these as well. Let's measure it. Yeah, 500, almost exactly 500. Now, you'll find that a lot of these craters are the same size. Now, if they were caused just by a meteor shower, they would all be very different sizes. But basically, this is a good example of a structure here that's been hit from above, either by a meteor or by some kind of missile or something like that, right? And you can actually see, if you look, if I zoom back, you can actually see there's the edge of a square structure here. You can see the shadow and the edge there, right? And in fact, if you take clips of these and then darken them and add a bit more contrast, you'll see these structures below as well, okay? And that's generally a good thing to do with these images, is to take a clip, say, of this square area here, and then darken it up, add contrast, and these things show much better, okay? Now, this has already been enhanced and colorized. The actual original image was black and white. This has been darkened, contrast added, and a color filter added, right? Because they're very, very pale, these images. Like some you see of the moon, they're very reflective and hard to look at, and they actually hurt your eyes. And you can link to the original images up here. If you go to the information, you can either link to them here, there's two here, or up here, okay? And you get all the different images there. So that's another one, right? Now, so that we've got a large crater, which is pretty round, with the remains of a square structure underneath. Okay, so we've got two so far. Now, there's more. Let's get this back on here so I can find it. Now, there is another one somewhere up here. There we are. Now, this one is really cool. And I'm going to rotate the image because it's a bit hard to look at that way round. So we want it this way round. I'll try and get it straight-ish. I zoom in. Now, this is a blatantly artificial complex we're looking at here. And what we have is a structure that's been hit here. You can see that I've outlined the edge of this structure, which is very straight here. We've got angled parts here coming round. Then we have a crater. Now, you may notice I've outlined this crater with straight edges, but that's just the way I've done it. That doesn't mean it's a structure. In fact, if you look at many craters, they have almost straight edges, and they have loads and loads of edges like this. They're rarely perfectly round. It depends on the ground. And especially if they've hit something hard, like a structure, then they're not usually perfectly round. They're usually sort of a bit angular, right? But only a bit. But this is a really good example. And we have a right angle structure here, and we have another one here. So we have two large structures in the ground. There are loads more around it as well, smaller ones that you can see in the ground. Check this out. You can see that there is a structure here, and it actually comes right up here, and then round here, and then to here, and then round here. I haven't outlined the whole thing because some of it's heavily buried here in sand dunes and stuff. But look how high the walls of this crater are compared to the structure underneath. These are buried, and this looks newer and higher. Look how high the edges of this crater is. Way more than, I would say, more than double the height of the actual structure below. That says it's later. Okay? Now that's one of the best examples because we have intelligent structures under it and next to it. Okay? Now, I will be showing you at the end of this video what I've done. I've taken clips of all the larger compounds and groups of structures like this. I've taken loads and loads of clips and I've animated them with the outlines on and off, and I've added a bit more contrast to the images to show the shapes better. Okay? I'll show you a couple in a minute, but basically I've got a whole load of them because this is just off the scale in the number of intelligent structures we have here. Well over 100 large intelligent structures, and a lot of them are in groups like this, which initially look just like random shapes in the ground, right? When you first look at it, you think, okay, this is interesting, but hang on a minute. If you go in closer and start to rotate the image round and look at these in different ways, you're seeing twin structures and intelligent shapes. Now, a lot of them are kind of have these joins in the middle, right? A lot of them have right angled corners like this one, and loads of them have got right angles in like this one here. It's absolutely mental. They're all over the place. There's so many, it's really, really hard for me to get this across. You've really got to look at this yourself and zoom in. You can switch off the outlines just by pressing that little thing there. Okay, and I mean it's just insane. It's very hard for me to get this all across. And when you look at some of these things, they're absolutely insane. They've got loads of straight edges. Okay, like this, and some of them are really quite complicated. Many of them have joining walls or separating walls halfway through, and many of them have structures inside, okay, which are buried. Now, what we're looking at here are compounds, and they're very large. A lot of them are sort of, they average around 200 meters, but there's loads that are bigger and way more that are smaller. This is a sort of average size one, about 200 or 300 meters across here. You can measure them with the measure here, right? And the structures inside, you can just about make out some here. There's one here and there's one here. It's all buried. So the only reason we're seeing these compound structures is because they have high walls on the outside. And the sand has drifted up against them and in fact has highlighted them very nicely. Now these walls here are probably way, way deeper than we're seeing. So these walls are probably something like 50 feet high. And we're only seeing the top part. And this is all filled in with sand. And sand has drifted up against these walls here, right? In these compounds. They're like forts or compounds. That's what they are. Armoured structures with thick walls on the outside and loads of structures inside, but most of it's buried. But some of them, you can actually see structures in the middle of them. There's great big sort of angular ones over this side. Let's actually straighten that out. Like this. Let's go around this way. And look at it that way round. Look at that. I mean, and when you deselect these, you'll see how straight these are. Now, of course, they're not, a lot of them aren't perfectly straight, but they are buried and dilapidated and probably, they may be 1,000,000 years old. They may be 500,000 years old. I don't know. Let's turn that off. But you can see how straight that is. And you can, like I showed you before in the previous video, you can get the edge of these. And if you line them up, you can see how straight they are by lining them up against the edge of the screen on your computer. A lot of these mounds like we have here have also got structures on them like we have here, just here. Okay? But they're much smaller, about 50 meters across. But there's a bunch of structures on there. And you can actually see the outline of a square structure here. And then there's loads more, but we're not seeing most of the smaller ones inside, okay? But a lot of these have got perfect right angles in them. And this is a real exercise in mathematical shapes. We have parallelograms, rhombuses, trapezoids, kite shapes. We've got all these, right? All these are represented here. A lot of these nonagons and decagons will actually be craters, of course. A lot of these, right? More rounded as well. But we have all these shapes here. We have all the mathematical shapes, and some of them are double or triple compounds with different shapes joined together. You can see that these are artificial and rectangular. Many of them are rectangular, right? But when you go in closer, you can see that they have these steps to them as well. They're not just straight rectangles or straight squares. They're a bit more complex than that. This is another good example here of a double one. Let's actually turn that round. So we got complexes that are in groups. But these are insane. And you can see these shapes in the ground. Symmetrical shapes that are joined together. Right? And this one's huge. And this one here is one of the larger ones. But we've got literally over 100 structures here. And many of them have right-angled corners on them. Some are more randomly shaped, but then have straight walls going across. And when you zoom in, they're actually very straight edges. They're not rounded at all. Now, if these were completely natural, they would be much more random and rounded, and you wouldn't have straight edges like this, right? I mean, look at this one. This one seems to represent some kind of animal shape as well. It's really odd. Some of them are crazy, absolutely insane. You can sort of turn them round and then fit into the screen like this. Now, this one here is probably artificial as well. This one here on the middle right, and there's loads of little tiny ones in the ground, like little 50-meter square structures as well. But look at these. I mean, it's a whole complex here. This one here got the joining wall. It's got these other parts, and you can see in a lot of them they've got structures inside, like here. This one's got loads of little squares inside it, just there. But it's all buried, right? So these were like city compounds or town compounds or village compounds, but all in a massive area which made up a city. And look at these complex shapes here. You've got all sorts going on here. You can actually see squares and rectangles in here. Loads of them. And here. Buildings, right? This was really cool because what we have at the top here is a big multiple complex of structures which has also been hit right smack in the middle there, almost. And I've marked that in red because that's a secondary crater. In other words, it's come after the structure, right? But we have a very complex set of structures here, like a multi-compound complex here, right? And we've got these strange geometric shapes, which are quite complicated, some of them, like these here. And then we have a big old crater right there, which is another 300-meter crater. And you can measure these. Now, the fact that a lot of these are the same size, these craters, 300 meters, says to me that the same thing struck them. In other words, a standard-sized object struck them. And when I say object, you know what I mean. Maybe a missile or something like that, okay? Either dropped from above or fired from a distance. Who knows? But the fact that that landed right in the middle of this complex and is the same size as some of these other craters that I've shown earlier says to me that these were targeted. These were actual military targets. So some of these may have been military bases. They may have been civilians. I don't know that were living in these complexes. I just don't know. There's no way to say. But if you look next to this, you can see loads of structures in the ground here, and many of them are buried, of course. The smaller ones here, like houses. These would have probably been loads of houses down here. You can see loads of them, little squares, blocky kind of squares in the ground, and they're all over the place. There's another outbuilding here, which is very rectangular. I'll centre that a bit and then get rid of that. You can actually see those shapes pretty well without the outlines on, you know. Now obviously they're rounded off a bit because they're kind of half buried in sand and they got sand drifted up against the edges. But these aren't natural. We've got rectangular ones, square ones, double rectangles, we've got triangular ones, we've got all sorts going on here. So it was probably targeted. I've outlined all these main ones anyway, apart from this one here, because it gets too cluttered. If you start outlining everything, there's too many and it clutters the image. So I've left a few out. But here's another good example of a structure that's been hit from above. Makes a bit more sense around that way for some reason. So we have a crater right on the edge of this structure, right? We've got a complex structure here, which is not that big, but it's probably part of a bigger one that went right across here. And let me get rid of that. So we got an artificial structure with an ovoid sort of rounded crater on it there, but you can see the structure here underneath, right? Mental, right? Look at that. Really cool. I mean, these things are everywhere. And some of these structures are really quite complicated. in shape, and they've got like corner structures like this as well. They've got smaller little squares. If you look inside some of these areas, you'll see lots of little squares and rectangles. Let's highlight that again. They're not rounded, they're straight edged. Some of them have many straight edges. This is a more simple one. But you can see the straight edges, right? You just have to see through some of the sand here and look at the general shapes. So this is what it looks like up the right way. And this one on the right is from the previous video that I showed, where we have all those crazy things like this sort of honeycomb structure as well at the bottom. But on this side, we've got more of these structures that were hit, like this one, which is my favourite one. So we've got a structure here. In fact, that outline should go right round like this, right round here, and you can see the outline of the structure goes right out like to here. So it's a huge structure there with a big crater right on it. I think they were targeted because it seems a bit of a coincidence that there aren't that many big craters in between these structures. And most of the large craters seem to have hit something. Like this one up here, right? I mean, I haven't even marked all this stuff. I mean, I've marked about half of the large structures here, maybe about 2/3. This one here is really interesting. Look at this. It's got like a square here with a dividing wall here and here. Absolutely mental. I'll go in a bit closer so you can see it. Right. Look, you can see a square right there. And you got this dividing part here and here. In fact, if you go back a bit, it's better to go back a little bit like that. You can see these things better. I would also like to thank Kelly W, who sent these clips in. Now, they're quite small clips that Kelly's done here, but there are many of these smaller structures. I mean, they're not that small. These are like 200 or 300 meters across, I think. But they're identical in size, these are, right? The same length. And you'll find that with a lot of these things on the ground, like Kelly sent in here. Many of these structures are actually the same size. And many of these craters are very similar in size. There's another one here. There's a couple of craters there, actually. Now, were they targeting this thing here? This looks like a square structure here. You can actually see a square. Not perfect square. You can see a square here. And there's something here as well. So there was some structure here and it's been targeted. So it's hit the edge of that one. I'm just going to show you a few of these clips. I'm not going to go through all of these because there will be, at the end of this video, an animated sequence showing all of these, right? A plain one, outline one, and then outlined negative. Because sometimes you can see the shapes better. And when you see these negatives, you'll start seeing, in a lot of these images, you'll see rectangular structures inside a lot of these compounds. In the middle or around the edges, you'll see loads of little squares and rectangles. Those are probably or possibly internal structures. This is a large set here, absolutely mental. I haven't outlined all of them. You can see that some of these are sort of squares and sort of diamond shapes, or they're more complex than basic geometric shapes, many of them, but they contain many geometric shapes, like we have up here on the left. This is that large one. This is really cool. This large complex here with the crater in the middle of it there. And we've got multiple geometric shapes around it, including rectangles, double structures here. We've got another one there, another one there. There's a double one here. They're all over the place. So there's that one in negative. This is a close-up of that complex, but flipped around the other way, right? And there it is. A nice rectangular one at the top there with internal structures. There's loads of internal walls here and structures in this one. And this one here, there's loads of little buildings in there which are buried, right? And there's another one here. You can see a structure here in this triangular one on the right. You can see some of them better in the negative. You can see structures inside some of these things. These have had a bit more contrast added, right? So you can see more of the shapes in the ground and buried underneath. There's loads inside this one here. Look at all this. Highly complex stuff going on inside these, right? But some are more buried than others. Depends which way they're facing and on the sand dunes and everything else. This is that structure that was hit from above with a large crater here. This has had more contrast added, so you can see the shapes better around it as well. So, but you can actually make out that the outer perimeter of this structure goes right up here. But the clearest part is this corner here at the bottom with the crater on top. Right? This corner here is really clear. We've got a nice shadow underneath it. But you can see that structure comes right out to here. You can see the outline of the buried walls here. But of course, a lot of it would have been blown away, so it's not very clear. The impact of this would have blown a lot of this material away. So these were probably much higher walls going around the outside of this one initially. Basically, what we have here is clear evidence of warfare on Mars. Concentrate on the larger structures and look inside some of them, like this one, and you will see that there's evidence of structures inside, internal buildings that are buried. But the ones to really concentrate on are these that have been hit, because that tells a story. And that kind of fits in with a lot of the theories that people have been coming up with over the years, including myself. Dr. Brandenburg, of course, says that Mars was nuked, and there's evidence of that up in the upper atmosphere. If you have these angled walls, right, it makes them stronger and more resistant to things like earthquakes. It also means if someone is attacking you, you have more angles to shoot from. So thanks for watching, everybody. Check out this animated sequence coming up now. See you soon.